Resented by WWE Vlog, chronicles an event that shook the foundation of what people believed was possible when two titans of the sport came together to share something far more meaningful than any championship victory or scripted narrative. The wrestling world had been waiting for this moment for what seemed like an eternity, and when it finally arrived, nobody was truly prepared for just how profoundly it would impact not only the athletes involved but the entire community of professional wrestling and the millions of fans who watched with bated breath. The atmosphere on that particular Monday night in April was electric with anticipation, yet nobody in the Crypto.com arena in Los Angeles could have fully anticipated what was about to unfold before them. The venue was packed to absolute capacity with wrestling enthusiasts, casual viewers, and industry professionals who had received whispers of something momentous about to occur. Throughout the months leading up to this event, the wrestling community had been buzzing with speculation about whether one of the most legendary figures in the history of professional wrestling would make an appearance. The rumors had persisted through multiple wrestling events, through various wrestling media outlets, and through endless discussions on social media platforms dedicated to discussing the sport. Backstage in the sprawling production facility that supported the broadcast, a man stood alone in the shadows, watching monitors that displayed the chaos and excitement of the live event unfolding in front of thousands of people. This man was Dwayne Johnson, known to millions worldwide as The Rock, and though he had left professional wrestling over a decade ago to pursue a career in entertainment and business that would make him one of the most recognizable figures on the entire planet, something had called him back. Something personal and profound had drawn him to this moment, to this place, and to this specific competitor who now occupied the center of the wrestling world. The journey that led to this moment actually began several months earlier in a place far removed from the glittering lights of professional wrestling arenas. It started in a hospital room in Hawaii, where Dwayne Johnson sat beside his father, Rocky Johnson, during what would turn out to be his final days on this earth. The Rock had always been a man of action, a person who moved forward with relentless determination, conquering every challenge that stood before him with the kind of focus and intensity that defined his character both inside and outside the ring. However, sitting in that hospital room with his father, time seemed to move differently than it ever had before. The seconds stretched into minutes, the minutes into hours, and the hours into something that felt eternal and fragile all at once. During these precious final conversations with his father, Rocky Johnson shared something that had been weighing heavily on his heart, something that had been eating away at him for years. Rocky saw in his son's observation of the wrestling world something that he recognized deeply. He saw a young wrestler in RomanReigns who was carrying an enormous weight on his shoulders, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He saw a man who was trying to transform himself into something more substantial than just an athlete or entertainer, someone who was attempting to define himself beyond the expectations that had been placed upon him since birth. Perhaps most importantly, Rocky Johnson recognized in RomanReigns a person who seemed to be carrying this weight entirely alone, without the support system or guidance that could help him navigate the treacherous waters of professional wrestling at the highest levels. The Rock, in his role as a devoted son, listened intently to his father's words. He absorbed the wisdom that Rocky was imparting, understanding that this was perhaps the most important advice his father would ever give him. After Rocky Johnson passed away, Dwayne found himself returning to professional wrestling in a way he had not anticipated. He began watching wrestling with an intensity and focus that he had not employed since his own active career had concluded. He paid close attention not just to the spectacle or the entertainment value of the product, but to the human beings who were putting their bodies and souls on the line for this industry. What Dwayne observed when he watched RomanReigns was deeply familiar to him. He saw a man who existed between worlds, caught in a liminal space between villain and hero, simultaneously embraced and rejected by audiences, powerful yet carrying vulnerabilities that the world rarely saw. It was, in many respects, The Rock's own story from his earlier years in the wrestling business, when he had to find his own path while dealing with the enormous expectations that came with carrying a name that was already legendary in professional wrestling circles. This recognition sparked something within The Rock that had been dormant for years. Over the course of several months that followed, Dwayne made the conscious decision to reach out to RomanReigns privately. Their initial conversations were characterized by a certain level of awkwardness, the kind of discomfort that naturally arises when two people are attempting to communicate across a significant gap in their respective careers and life experiences. However, as their discussions continued and deepened, something began to shift. The conversations became more genuine, more meaningful, and more focused on the real struggles and challenges that came with being at the top of professional wrestling. The Rock began to understand Roman's internal battles in a way that perhaps only someone who had walked a similar path could truly comprehend. He recognized the pressure, the expectations, the comparisons, and the relentless scrutiny that came with being a prominent figure in professional wrestling. Now, as The Rock stood backstage at the Crypto.com arena, his massive frame silhouetted against the glow of countless television monitors, he knew that the moment had finally arrived. He had made the decision to break his silence, to step back into the public eye of professional wrestling, not as a competitor seeking to regain glory or prove his dominance, but as a mentor and family member who understood what Roman was going through and could offer perspective that only came from experience. The crowd in the arena did not immediately understand what was happening. Roman Reigns stood alone in the center of the ring, his undisputed WWE Universal Championship belt gleaming brilliantly under the professional lighting that illuminated every corner of the wrestling venue. The tribal chief had established himself over nearly a decade as perhaps the most dominant and controversial figure in the modern era of professional wrestling. His journey had been anything but simple. He had been pushed as the golden boy of the organization only to face rejection from fans who felt he was being forced upon them. He had been booed out of buildings, criticized relentlessly, and doubted by many within the industry and without. Yet through sheer determination and an evolution of his character that demonstrated genuine growth and adaptation, he had become a figure that commanded the attention and respect of the entire wrestling world. However, recent months had brought changes in Roman that were impossible to ignore. His promos had begun to contain a quality of vulnerability that had not been as evident before. His wrestling matches, while still showcasing his physical dominance and technical skill, began to reveal cracks in his armor. Behind the scenes, industry insiders began to whisper about deeper issues that Roman might be confronting, personal demons that extended beyond anything that could be resolved through athletic competition or championship victories. There were suggestions that he was wrestling against internal doubts about his legacy, about whether he would ever be able to escape from the shadow cast by those legendary wrestlers who had come before him in the industry. The announcement that The Rock would be making an appearance on this particular event had sent shockwaves through the professional wrestling community and beyond. News outlets that did not even typically cover professional wrestling had picked up the story. Social media platforms had been flooded with speculation and discussion. Yet nobody truly understood what The Rock's purpose would be in returning after such an extended absence. Nobody could predict what message could be so vitally important that it would compel someone of The Rock's stature to break his years-long hiatus from in-ring appearances and involvement with professional wrestling. As the crowd settled into their seats and the programming continued, Roman stood in the ring waiting for whatever was about to be revealed. The announcement came through the public address system, and before the crowd could fully process what they were hearing, the familiar and unmistakable opening began to play. The music that had not been heard live in an arena for over a decade suddenly filled the space, and the reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people jumped to their feet simultaneously. Some screamed at the top of their lungs. Others sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces. A few individuals seemed almost unable to process what they were experiencing. The entire arena transformed into a cacophony of pure emotion and excitement as the unmistakable opening riff of The Rock's theme music echoed throughout the venue. However, The Rock did not immediately make his way to the ring as people might have expected. Instead, his image appeared on the massive video screen, displayed live from the backstage area of the production facility. His face was serious, his expression carefully composed. This was not the showboating entertainer, the person known for his quick wit and comedic delivery that had made him such a beloved figure throughout his career. Instead, this was something more sincere, more genuine, and more profoundly serious than people had anticipated seeing from The Rock. Speaking directly into the camera, The Rock addressed Roman Reigns with a tone that made it clear this was a message being delivered from the heart. He acknowledged that for the longest time, he had not fully understood what Roman was attempting to accomplish in the wrestling business. He had watched Roman evolve and transform, and he admitted openly that there were moments when he found himself uncertain about what to think regarding the direction Roman's character was taking. Roman had become something that nobody had anticipated or expected. He had become a figure that many people hated and rejected. Yet over time, through patience and dedication, Roman had managed to help people understand that he was not attempting to be The Rock, and he was certainly not trying to replicate what any other wrestler before him had accomplished. Instead, Roman was genuinely attempting to discover and define who he truly was as a performer and as a person, and that realization took more courage and inner strength than The Rock had initially given him credit for. The Rock explained that before his father had passed away, Rocky Johnson had called him with something important to share. He told his son that he saw in Roman Reigns a young man who was carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, and perhaps most troublingly, he was carrying this burden completely alone without support or guidance from those who had walked similar paths before. According to Rocky, This was not the way things should work, particularly not within their family tradition and the culture of professional wrestling that had defined their lives. Family was supposed to be there for one another. Wrestling was supposed to be a collective endeavor that bound people together rather than isolated them through impossible expectations and pressure. The camera showed The Rock backstage, now displaying him in his full physical presence. To the shock and amazement of every person watching, he was wearing wrestling attire, something that the world had not seen in such an extended period that it felt almost surreal and dreamlike to witness. The Rock spoke further about what his father had made him understand during those final conversations. He explained that real wrestling, when you stripped away all the entertainment components and theatrical elements, was fundamentally a family affair. It was about what you built and, more importantly, who you built it with. It was about having the strength to carry each other when one person started to falter or fall. It was about recognizing that Roman, whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not, was his cousin in this business, his family member in the wrestling world. Roman was the person who had come after him, who had been forced to deal with the endless comparisons to what The Rock had accomplished, who had to forge his own distinct path against the overwhelming tide of expectations and doubts. The Rock paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle into the hearts and minds of everyone who was listening. Then he spoke words that would change everything. He told Roman that he saw him. He saw the internal struggle that Roman was facing. He could perceive the man underneath the carefully constructed character, beneath the persona that Roman presented to the world. And most importantly, The Rock wanted Roman to know that he respected the hell out of what Roman was attempting to build and achieve. With that, The Rock made his way toward the ring. The crowd's reaction was beyond description. The chanting began immediately, with tens of thousands of voices calling out his name with an intensity that had only grown during his extended absence from the wrestling world. He climbed through the ropes and stood face to face with RomanReigns in the center of the ring. For a prolonged moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other, two men separated by time and circumstance, yet connected by wrestling and by something far more profound than any competition or rivalry. It was a moment of genuine acknowledgement, a meeting between a legend of the past and the person building the legend of the present, and in that silent exchange, they seemed to be understanding something deeper than words could convey. Then The Rock began to speak to the crowd, his voice amplified by the arena speakers so that every person in the venue and millions watching around the world could hear his words. He reflected on the time when he had been carrying the championship, when he had possessed a clear vision of what it meant to be the top guy in professional wrestling. He had believed then that being the top wrestler meant being bigger than everyone else, louder than the competition, more charismatic than any other performer, and more dominant in terms of physical capability and athletic skill. He had thought that if he could make people laugh and make them believe that he was truly unstoppable, then he would have accomplished his mission and done his job correctly. And in some ways, The Rock acknowledged he had been right about those things. However, The Rock also recognized that he had been fundamentally wrong about other crucial aspects. He had missed something essential in his understanding of what it truly meant to be at the top of his profession. He had overlooked the fact that being the top wrestler was not ultimately about you as an individual person. It was about everybody else around you. It was about carrying forward the legacy of everyone who had come before you in the business. And it was about building a bridge for everyone who would come after you, ensuring that the path was smoother and clearer for the next generation. The Rock explained that being at the top of professional wrestling was isolating and lonely because the world placed impossible expectations on you. Society expected you to have all the answers. The fans expected you to be perfect in every way. The industry expected you to never show weakness, never demonstrate struggle, never allow anyone to see you wrestling against your doubts or your fears. Yet The Rock had found himself struggling far more than he had allowed anyone to know during his active career in professional wrestling. He had wrestled against internal demons and doubts, and he harbored significant regrets about not having someone who could have told him then what he was now telling Roman: that it was acceptable to not have all the answers, that it was permissible to be scared, that it was entirely okay to be vulnerable, and to allow people to see you working through your fears and uncertainties. Because the real strength, The Rock explained, was not found in pretending that you had everything figured out and that you were invincible. The true strength came from allowing people to witness you figuring things out, from being honest about your struggles, and from asking for help when you needed it. Roman's expression, that carefully controlled tribal chief persona that he had cultivated over years of performing, began to visibly crack as he listened to The Rock's words. The emotional weight of what was being said seemed to penetrate the defensive barriers that Roman had constructed around himself over years of carrying the burden of professional wrestling at the highest levels. The Rock continued speaking, reflecting on his decision to step away from professional wrestling. He explained that he had convinced himself that he had moved on to bigger and more significant things in his life, and in many ways that was true. He had pursued a career in motion pictures. He had built a production company. He had become involved in various business ventures that had made him one of the most recognizable and financially successful individuals on the planet. But The Rock came to realize that he had been running from something. He had been attempting to escape from the responsibility that came with being part of wrestling's legacy and lineage. He now understood that his father had not passed away so that his son could abandon professional wrestling and pretend it no longer mattered to him. Rather, Rocky Johnson had passed away so that his son would finally comprehend what truly matters in life. And what truly matters is the connection between people, the bonds that tie individuals together, and the mutual support that allows everyone to thrive rather than merely survive. The Rock then made a gesture that stunned everyone who was watching. He raised his hand and placed it gently against Roman's face. This was not an aggressive gesture meant to escalate tension or challenge Roman in any way. Instead, it was a gesture filled with genuine care and affection, something that felt almost paternal, yet unmistakably familial in a way that transcended the scripted and theatrical nature of professional wrestling. With his hand against Roman's face, The Rock spoke words that would echo through the wrestling world for years to come. He told Roman that there would be nights when Roman would feel like he did not deserve to be in the ring, that he was not worthy of the position he held. He told Roman that there would be moments when the pressure became almost unbearable, when the weight seemed impossible to carry. He explained that there would be people who would tear Roman down, who would insist that he did not belong in professional wrestling, who would claim that he could never live up to what came before him. The Rock told Roman that in those moments of doubt and despair, he wanted Roman to remember this exact moment. He wanted Roman to remember that the man standing before him was telling him that he belonged. Not because of genetics or family history, not because of what his last name was or where he came from, but because of the choice that Roman made every single day to show up and give everything he had to professional wrestling. Then The Rock addressed the audience directly, addressing everyone who was watching this moment unfold. He wanted every person to understand something crucial about what they were witnessing. This was not about The Rock coming back to demonstrate that he was better than anyone else. This was not about The Rock stepping into the spotlight to overshadow everything that Roman had built and accomplished over the years. Instead, this was about two people who were connected through professional wrestling, acknowledging a fundamental truth that many people refuse to accept: that the struggle is real, the pressure is genuinely overwhelming, and the only way that any of us can survive these enormous burdens is by doing it together rather than alone. The energy in the crowd had shifted noticeably during this interaction. The noise and excitement that had characterized the crowd's reaction when The Rock first appeared had transformed into something more profound and meaningful. There was a collective understanding spreading through the arena that they were witnessing something that transcended the typical theatrical and entertainment-focused nature of professional wrestling. They were witnessing genuine human connection, authentic emotion, and a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The Rock then addressed what he understood to be the larger significance of this moment. He explained that his father had wrestled in professional wrestling. He himself had wrestled in professional wrestling. Because of these choices that his father and he had made, Roman Reigns got to wrestle, and he got to make choices about how he would approach this business. But The Rock emphasized that this lineage and this tradition did not stop with Roman. There were children watching this moment right now who would go on to wrestle in professional wrestling. There were people sitting in that arena at that very moment who were contemplating stepping into a ring for the first time. And The Rock wanted to send a message to all of them, a message that would extend far beyond Roman's personal journey. The message was this: the legacy of professional wrestling is not fundamentally about the number of times you win a match or how many championships you accumulate. The true legacy of professional wrestling is about what you stand for as a person. It is about who you lift up along the way. It is about refusing to allow the weight of expectations to completely break you, and instead choosing to be shaped and molded by those expectations into something genuinely beautiful and meaningful. It is about recognizing that your journey in professional wrestling is not a solo endeavor but a collective experience that connects you to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The Rock then placed his hand on Roman's shoulder, a gesture of complete acknowledgement and acceptance. Roman reciprocated by placing his hand on The Rock's chest, a gesture that conveyed his own genuine connection and appreciation. In that moment, with both men connected physically and emotionally in the center of the ring, something shifted in the entire wrestling world. The crowd understood that they were witnessing history in the making, a moment that would define professional wrestling for years to come. What followed after The Rock eventually made his exit from the ring was unprecedented in the wrestling world. Roman stood alone in the ring for an extended period, his championship belt no longer the only thing he carried into that moment. Now he carried something else intangible yet powerful, a sense of being seen and validated by someone whose opinion mattered immensely. He carried permission, in a sense, to be human, to acknowledge his struggles, and to know that he did not have to carry this burden entirely by himself. When Roman raised his microphone to speak, the entire arena fell completely silent so that every person could hear what he was about to say. He began by acknowledging that he did not have words that could adequately express what he was feeling in that moment. He explained that for several years, he had been attempting to prove something to everyone around him, something fundamental and essential to how he understood his place in professional wrestling. He had been trying to prove that he belonged in this business, that he was worthy of the platform that he had been given. He had been attempting to demonstrate that he could be more than just an athlete or competitor, that he could be a storyteller, a champion, and a figure who was worth paying attention to and supporting. Roman acknowledged that every night he had stepped into that ring, he had been carrying an immense weight. It was the weight of expectations that came from an industry and a fandom that had very specific ideas about what he should be. It was the weight of comparisons to other wrestlers who had come before him. It was the weight of people waiting and anticipating his failure. And perhaps most significantly, it was the weight of trying desperately not to allow all of this pressure to crush him completely, to break his spirit, to make him give up on his dreams. Roman then looked in the direction where The Rock had exited, and he spoke directly to this acknowledgement. He said that he had come to professional wrestling because of wrestlers like The Rock, because of the example that they had set. However, what Roman had not fully understood before this moment was that The Rock and other wrestlers before him were not just showing him an example of how to win matches and accumulate championships. They were showing him an example of how to survive, how to persist despite overwhelming odds, how to remain human and connected to others even when the world demanded that you become invincible and untouchable. Roman stated that he had been carrying this burden alone for far too long, and that he now understood the fundamental need to approach his career and his life differently moving forward. He promised that he would continue to be the best competitor that he could be, that he would keep the championship, and that he would continue to evolve as both a performer and as a human being. However, he would do all of this with a newfound understanding that nobody achieves anything significant by themselves, that every person who has played a role in his life has shaped who he is, and that he was grateful for every single person who had contributed to his journey, whether they had believed in him or rejected him. The consequences of that profound moment in the center of the ring began to ripple through professional wrestling and beyond in ways that nobody could have anticipated or predicted. Within days, The Rock and Roman Reigns began appearing together more frequently at various wrestling events. But this was not a competitive arrangement where they were positioned against each other. Instead, it was a mentoring relationship where The Rock provided guidance and shared stories from his extensive career that gave Roman context and perspective for his own journey through professional wrestling. The Rock began attending shows regularly, offering advice to Roman, and helping him navigate the complexities of being at the top of the professional wrestling world while maintaining his humanity and connections to those around him. More significantly, The Rock's return to professional wrestling signaled something much bigger to everyone in the industry and to the millions of fans watching around the world. It communicated that professional wrestling still mattered, that it was still worthy of investment and attention from those who had achieved massive success outside of it. It demonstrated that the people who had built professional wrestling into a global phenomenon still cared deeply about its future, and were willing to invest their time and energy in ensuring that it continued to thrive and evolve. This signal from The Rock seemed to inspire other legendary wrestlers to take similar action. Stone Cold Steve Austin began appearing on various wrestling broadcasts to offer his own perspective on leadership and what it truly meant to carry the weight of being at the top of professional wrestling. Shawn Michaels, another legendary figure from earlier eras of the sport, made his presence known at shows where he could work with younger talent in meaningful and impactful ways. The Undertaker, who had been moving towards semi-retirement, decided to establish a formal mentorship program specifically designed to help the next generation of wrestlers understand the responsibility that came with carrying forward wrestling's legacy and lineage. Roman's character began to evolve once again in response to this shift in his professional and personal life, but this time in a direction that felt far more authentic and genuine than any previous iteration of his persona. He remained the tribal chief in terms of his wrestling presentation, still a dominant champion who could defeat anyone placed in front of him. However, there was now a visible layer of humanity beneath that persona. He became more open and honest in his promos about the genuine struggle of being in professional wrestling. He was no longer afraid to display vulnerability in front of millions of people. And instead of the audience interpreting this vulnerability as weakness or a chink in his armor, they responded to it as genuine strength. They recognized that a person who could acknowledge his struggles while still maintaining his dominance was someone truly worthy of respect and admiration. The storylines that unfolded over the following months and years were fundamentally different from anything professional wrestling had produced before. They were not merely focused on wins and losses, on who could defeat whom in combat. Instead, the storylines centered on growth, understanding, personal evolution, and the journey toward self-acceptance. When Roman Reigns stepped into the ring to face challengers, the matches took on a different quality and meaning because everyone in the audience understood what was truly at stake. It was not simply about retaining a championship. It was about a man's ongoing journey toward accepting himself, toward understanding his place in professional wrestling, and toward the realization that his strength came not from standing completely alone, but from the connections he maintained with others. Behind the scenes, the relationship that had developed between The Rock and Roman Reigns deepened into something that transcended professional wrestling and the business aspects of entertainment. It became something genuinely meaningful and substantial. The Rock found himself flying back to various wrestling events regularly, not necessarily for scheduled appearances or contractual obligations, but simply because he wanted to be there and wanted to be part of this moment in Roman's life. He and Roman began having meals together, talking about business opportunities, discussing their families, and contemplating the future direction of professional wrestling and how they could both contribute to its evolution. One particular conversation between The Rock and Roman seemed to shift the entire trajectory of everything that would follow. Roman expressed to The Rock that he wanted to accomplish something bigger and more significant than simply holding a championship or being the wrestler that people paid to see in sold-out arenas. Roman explained that he wanted to build something that would have lasting impact, something that would help people coming after him not have to navigate the intense pressure and burden of professional wrestling alone the way that he had. Roman wanted to create something that would leave a positive impact on the entire industry. The Rock smiled when he heard this. It was the first true indication that he was seeing in Roman not just a wrestler or even just a champion, but a true visionary, someone who understood that the purpose of wrestling extended far beyond individual achievement or personal glory. The Rock immediately responded that they should do this together, that they should work as partners and collaborators to build something meaningful. And with that commitment, they began planning what would eventually become known as the Legacy Bridge Program, an official initiative that would work in concert with professional wrestling organizations to connect seasoned veterans with up-and-coming talent. The Legacy Bridge program went far beyond anything that existed in professional wrestling before. It was not simply a training program where experienced wrestlers taught technical skills to younger athletes. Instead, it was a comprehensive initiative that focused on multiple dimensions of professional wrestling and the lives of those involved in it. It included discussions about mental health and the psychological challenges that came with being a professional wrestler. It addressed financial planning and business literacy, ensuring that young wrestlers understood how to manage their earnings and plan for their futures. It provided education about the business side of professional wrestling, helping younger talent understand the economics of the industry and how to position themselves for success. Most importantly, it created genuine connections between veterans and young wrestlers, mentoring relationships that could last for years and provide consistent support and guidance. The Rock and Roman both became deeply involved in making the Legacy Bridge program successful and impactful. They started appearing at events that were specifically designed to give younger wrestlers access to veterans who had already navigated the complex and often treacherous waters of professional wrestling at the highest levels. These events became places where stories could be shared openly, without the filter of entertainment or the need to maintain a certain public image. Wrestlers talked honestly about their struggles, their doubts, their fears, and their triumphs. They shared lessons that they had learned, often through difficult and painful experiences. By the time WrestleMania came around the following year, Roman Reigns had evolved into something that the professional wrestling world had never quite seen before. He was still a dominant champion, someone who could defeat practically anyone who stepped into the ring with him. But he had also become a champion with a purpose that extended far beyond his own personal legacy. He began using his platform and his position to elevate other wrestlers. He worked with younger and less experienced performers in ways that helped them grow and develop their skills and their characters. He gave back to the professional wrestling community through his involvement with the Legacy Bridge program. When Roman eventually lost his championship, and it was a loss that felt earned because of how it was wrestled and the story that was being told, the moment did not feel like a tragedy or an ending. Instead, it felt like an evolution, a natural progression in Roman's career. Roman stepped into a new role in professional wrestling, one where his primary focus was on mentoring and helping to build the next generation of champions. Rather than standing alone at the peak of professional wrestling, Roman was now finding fulfillment in helping others climb that mountain and discover their own paths to success. The Rock, meanwhile, had fully embraced his return to professional wrestling's fold and to his connection with the wrestling community. He started training again regularly, not because he was preparing for a major competitive match or because he was trying to prove that he could still compete at the highest levels, but because he wanted to stay connected to the art form that had given him everything. He appeared on wrestling broadcasts regularly, but these appearances were primarily in mentoring capacities rather than as a competitor. He even orchestrated his own match, but this was not a match meant to determine who was the better wrestler or who was most dominant. It was simply an opportunity for The Rock to demonstrate that the warrior spirit that had defined him throughout his life never truly dies, and that returning to the business that you love does not necessarily require you to be at your absolute physical best. It simply requires you to be present and engaged, bringing your passion and your experience to the endeavor. Years later, people throughout the professional wrestling world would still talk about that moment when The Rock broke his silence. It had become legendary in the truest sense of the word, retold and discussed and analyzed from every possible angle. But the more people talked about it and reflected on it, the more they came to understand that the moment was never really fundamentally about The Rock and Roman Reigns as individuals. Instead, it was about what their connection and their willingness to be vulnerable represented on a larger scale. Their connection represented the idea that legacies are not built in isolation. The moment demonstrated that the greatest achievements are the ones that we accomplish together with others. It showed that vulnerability is not weakness but rather a form of genuine strength. It communicated that admitting we need help, that acknowledging the burden is heavy, that being honest about our struggles, these things are not something to be ashamed of or to hide. Instead, these are things to share with others, to discuss openly, and to use as a means of creating deeper connections with the people around us. Young wrestlers who were just entering the professional wrestling industry started approaching their careers differently because of what they had witnessed when The Rock broke his silence and connected with Roman Reigns. Rather than believing that they had to prove themselves as isolated individuals, they started building relationships with experienced wrestlers and veterans not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine respect and a sincere desire to learn from their experience and wisdom. They started being more open and honest about their mental health struggles, about the intense pressure that they felt as young wrestlers, about their doubts and their fears regarding their future in the business. And perhaps most importantly, the generation of wrestlers that came after this moment started understanding in a fundamental way that they did not have to carry all of this weight by themselves. They understood that reaching out for help was not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of intelligence and self-awareness. They recognized that the strongest people are not those who stand completely alone, but rather those who are willing to acknowledge their limitations and ask for support from those around them. A year after that initial powerful moment when The Rock broke his silence, The Rock and Roman Reigns sat down together for an extended interview that was broadcast on wrestling programming and subsequently shared across every major media platform and social media channel in existence. In this interview, The Rock reflected on his motivations for returning to professional wrestling. He explained that when he first decided to come back, he thought that his primary purpose was to help Roman Reigns. He believed that he would be serving in the role of mentor and guide, the person with all the answers who could help Roman navigate his challenges and overcome his obstacles. The Rock acknowledged that what actually happened was quite different from what he had anticipated. What actually occurred was that he came to realize and understand that he needed Roman Reigns just as much as Roman needed him. The Rock explained that he had been running away from professional wrestling for many years. He had convinced himself that he had moved on to bigger and better things in his life, and to some extent that was absolutely true. He had built an incredible career in motion pictures and entertainment. He had amassed significant wealth and achieved a level of global fame that few people ever experience. He had accomplished things that most people would consider to be the ultimate measure of success in life. However, during all of this success in other areas of his life, The Rock had left a part of himself behind in professional wrestling. There was a part of his identity and his soul that still belonged to wrestling, that would always belong to wrestling, regardless of how successful he became in other pursuits. He had never truly made peace with stepping away from the business that had given him his start and shaped him into the person that he became. When his father passed away, it forced The Rock to confront this truth. Rocky Johnson helped his son understand something that was truly important. That legacy is not ultimately about the amount of money that you accumulate or how famous you become on a global scale. Real legacy is about who you leave behind. It is about whether you lifted anyone up during your time on this earth. It is about whether you made it easier, more manageable, or more bearable for the people who come after you. The interview then cut to various wrestlers from different eras and different levels of experience within professional wrestling, all talking about how the moment when The Rock broke his silence had fundamentally changed them. They spoke about how it gave them permission to be more authentic and genuine in their approach to professional wrestling. They explained how seeing The Rock admit that he had struggled, how witnessing Roman Reigns completely break down those emotional walls that he had constructed around himself, how these things showed everyone watching that even the biggest names in professional wrestling carried doubts, fears, and insecurities. One young wrestler who was just starting out in professional wrestling spoke particularly emotionally about how watching that segment with his father had changed his life. He described being absolutely terrified when he first entered professional wrestling. He did not know if he truly belonged in this business. He was not confident in his ability to handle the intense pressure that came with being a professional wrestler. He doubted whether he could truly accomplish anything significant in the wrestling world. However, after watching The Rock acknowledge his own struggles and seeing Roman demonstrate that it was acceptable to have breakdowns and emotional moments, everything shifted for this young wrestler. He realized that it was completely acceptable to be scared when you are starting a career in professional wrestling. He understood that not having all the answers was not a disqualifying factor. And most importantly, he came to understand that asking for help and showing vulnerability was not just acceptable but actually a sign of genuine strength and self-awareness. 5 years after that fateful night when The Rock broke his silence, the entire landscape of professional wrestling had been transformed in fundamental ways. Mental health resources and support for professional wrestlers were now standard offerings rather than exceptions. The Legacy Bridge program had expanded far beyond its original scope and now operated globally, serving wrestlers in multiple countries and multiple wrestling organizations. Veterans and up-and-coming talent were now working together in structured mentorship relationships that were based on genuine care and concern rather than simple obligation or contractual necessity. Roman Reigns had eventually returned to championship contention, but this time as a leader who focused on lifting others up rather than tearing people down to maintain his position. His matches had become character studies in resilience, growth, and personal evolution. He told stories in the ring that resonated deeply with people, because they were rooted in authentic human experience and genuine emotion rather than just wrestling spectacle and athletic performance. The Rock, who had initially come back for what was supposed to be just a single appearance, found himself returning regularly to professional wrestling events. He started working collaboratively with wrestling organizations on various projects and initiatives, always keeping his film career as his primary focus, but never allowing wrestling to slip away from his life again. He had finally come to terms with the fact that you do not have to choose between the life you build and the life that built you. You can honor your past while still creating your future. The wrestling world as a whole, including the fans, the wrestlers, and everyone involved in the industry at every level, shifted towards something that felt more authentic and more human. The public conversations in wrestling media began to reference that moment when The Rock broke his silence as a genuine turning point in wrestling history, not because of anything dramatic that occurred in the wrestling ring itself, but because of what happened in people's hearts and minds. Because two men, both carrying the weight of wrestling legacies, both struggling in their own distinct ways, had the tremendous courage to acknowledge their struggles and to work through them together rather than separately. That was the message that changed everything in professional wrestling, that genuine strength is not found in standing completely alone, that real legacy is not about how brightly you can shine by yourself, but rather about how you lift others up and help them become better versions of themselves. The most powerful moments in professional wrestling and perhaps in life itself are the moments where we acknowledge that we are all carrying something, and that we are all stronger and more capable when we carry these burdens together rather than in isolation. The Rock had finally broken his silence, and in doing so, he had shown an entire industry and a world watching that silence is what keeps us isolated from one another, and that speaking our truth, acknowledging our struggles, and reaching out to those around us is what truly makes us great.